Margaret Sullivan wiped her hands on her old apron and stared at the piece of paper that would change everything. The bright red letters seemed to jump off the white paper. Final notice, followed by words that made her heart sink. 30 days. That's all she had left. She had found the eviction notice taped to the front door of Sullivan's Family Diner when she arrived that Tuesday morning at 5:30, just like she had every morning for the past 23 years. But this morning felt different. This morning everything felt like it was falling apart. The diner sat on the corner of Main Street and Oak Avenue in the small town of Millbrook, population 4,200. It wasn't much to look at from the outside, just a simple building with big windows, a red and white striped awning, and a wooden sign that Tom had painted by hand all those years ago. But inside it was home. The smell of fresh coffee and bacon grease, the sound of eggs sizzling on the grill, and the gentle chatter of neighbors catching up over breakfast. This was what Margaret lived for. She walked through the empty dining room, her footsteps echoing on the checkered linoleum floor. The tables and chairs were old but sturdy, each one holding memories of countless conversations, first dates, business deals, and family celebrations. The counter where she served coffee had been polished smooth by thousands of elbows and hands over the years. This place wasn't just a restaurant, it was the heart of Millbrook. Margaret was 68 now, and running the diner alone had become harder than she ever imagined. When Tom died 3 years ago from a sudden heart attack, she thought she could keep going. Tom had always handled the business side of things, the bills, the ordering, the scheduling. Margaret was the cook, the hostess, the face that everyone loved to see when they walked through the door. But keeping a small business running was like trying to hold water in your hands. No matter how tightly you squeezed, it always seemed to slip through your fingers. The trouble had started slowly. First, the Walmart came to the next town over, and people began shopping there instead of at the local stores. Then the factory that employed half the town announced they were moving operations to Mexico. Families started leaving Millbrook, looking for work in bigger cities. The customers who used to fill her tables every morning became fewer and fewer. Margaret tried everything she could think of. She offered early bird specials, added new items to the menu, and even started staying open later for dinner service. But every month, the numbers got worse. The electric bill, the gas bill, the food suppliers, everyone wanted their money, and there just wasn't enough coming in. Her hands weren't what they used to be either. Arthritis had crept into her joints over the years, making it painful to stand for long hours or lift heavy pots. Some mornings, she could barely open the pickle jars. She had to let go of her 2 part-time employees 6 months ago because she simply couldn't afford to pay them anymore. Now it was just her, working from dawn until dark, trying to keep the dream alive. Margaret sat down in booth number 3, Tom's favorite spot where he used to read the newspaper every morning before the rush began. She spread the eviction notice on the table and read it again, hoping the words might somehow change. But they didn't. The landlord, Mr. Peterson, was demanding 3 months of back rent plus late fees. The total came to $8,400, money she simply didn't have. She had tried calling Peterson the week before, explaining her situation, asking for more time. His response was cold and businesslike. "Margaret, I understand your situation, but I have my own bills to pay. You're 3 months behind and I can't carry you anymore." The worst part was that she understood his position. Peterson wasn't a bad man. He had actually been patient with her longer than most landlords would have been. But patience had its limits, and she had reached his. Margaret looked around the diner that had been her life for so many years. Every corner held a memory. There was the booth where young couples often had their first dates, nervously sharing a milkshake. The table by the window where the retired teachers met every Thursday to discuss books and gossip about the town. The counter stool where old Frank used to sit every morning, drinking coffee and complaining about the weather until the day he passed away last winter. This place wasn't just her business. It was where the community came together. In a world where everyone seemed to be rushing around staring at their phones, the diner was one of the few places where people still sat down, looked each other in the eye, and had real conversations. But maybe those days were over. Maybe small-town diners like hers were becoming relics of the past. unable to compete with fast food chains and modern life. Margaret's phone buzzed. It was a text from her daughter Linda, who lived 2 states away with her own family. "Hey Mom, just checking in. How are things at the diner?" Margaret stared at the message for a long time before typing back, "Everything's fine, honey. Just busy as always." She couldn't bring herself to tell Linda the truth. Her daughter had offered to help financially before, but Margaret knew Linda, and her husband were saving for their own children's college funds. Besides, Margaret had always been independent, proud of building something from nothing with Tom. The idea of asking for help felt like admitting defeat. The sun was starting to come up, painting the sky outside a soft pink color. Soon her first customers would start arriving. The construction workers who grabbed coffee and donuts before heading to job sites, the nurses finishing their overnight shifts at the county hospital, the farmers who liked to start their day with a hearty breakfast before working their fields. Margaret stood up, folded the eviction notice, and slipped it into her apron pocket. She had a diner to run, even if it might only be for 30 more days. She turned on the grill, started the coffee, and began preparing for another day of serving her community, wondering if each customer might be among the last she would ever serve in the place that had been her world for more than 2 decades. As she cracked the first eggs of the day, Margaret allowed herself a moment of quiet sadness for everything that was ending. But she also felt a small spark of something else, a stubborn determination that had carried her through losing Tom, through empty tables and unpaid bills, and through all the challenges that life had thrown her way. Maybe 30 days wasn't much time, but it was still time, and Margaret Sullivan wasn't ready to give up without a fight. 3 days had passed since Margaret found that awful notice on her door. She tried to keep things normal, serving coffee with a smile, flipping pancakes, and making small talk with her customers. But inside, she felt like she was drowning. Every time the bell above the door chimed, she looked up hoping for a miracle customer who might somehow save her business. It was Friday morning around 9:30 when the breakfast rush had died down to just a few stragglers. Margaret was wiping down tables when she noticed him sitting in the corner booth, a young man she'd seen a few times before but had never really talked to. He was maybe in his late 20s with short dark hair and careful eyes that seemed to watch everything around him. He always sat alone, always ordered just coffee and toast, and always left exact change on the table. Today was different though. Instead of staring out the window like usual, he was watching her. When Margaret caught his eye, he raised his hand slightly and said, "Excuse me, ma'am? Could I talk to you for a minute?" Margaret walked over with the coffee pot thinking he wanted a refill. "Of course, honey, what can I do for you?" The young man shifted in his seat like he was nervous about something. "My name's James Mitchell. I've been coming in here for about 2 months now and I couldn't help but notice you seem pretty stressed lately." Margaret felt her cheeks get warm. She thought she'd been hiding her worries better than that. "Oh, I'm fine, just the usual business stuff, you know." James nodded slowly. "I heard you on the phone yesterday morning. With your landlord, I think, about maybe having to close down." Margaret's stomach dropped. She remembered that phone call. Peterson had called during the morning rush, demanding to know when he'd get his money. She had tried to keep her voice down, but the diner was small and sound carried. "I'm sorry," she said quickly. "I didn't mean for customers to hear that. It's really not—" "Ma'am," James interrupted gently. "I'm not trying to be nosy. I just want to help." Margaret looked at him more carefully. There was something about the way he sat, straight-backed, alert, that reminded her of her nephew who had served in the military. "Are you a soldier?" she asked. "Was," James said. "Army. Just got back from my second tour in Iraq about 6 months ago." That explained the careful way he watched the room, always sitting with his back to the wall where he could see the door. Margaret had noticed those little things but hadn't put the pieces together. "Well, that's very kind of you to offer, but I don't think there's much anyone can do," Margaret said, trying to keep her voice steady. James leaned forward. "Actually, there might be. I've got a proposition for you." Margaret raised her eyebrows. "A proposition?" "I know you probably can't afford to hire help right now," James said, But what if someone worked for free, in exchange for meals, I mean? Margaret stared at him. Honey, I appreciate the thought, but I can barely afford to feed myself these days, let alone— Please, just hear me out, James said. I'm not looking for charity. I'm looking for purpose, I guess. He was quiet for a moment, and Margaret could see he was choosing his words carefully. When I came back from overseas, everything felt wrong, he continued. The doctors at the VA, they have fancy names for it, but basically I just couldn't figure out how to be normal again, how to be around people, how to feel useful. Margaret poured herself a cup of coffee and sat down across from him. Something in his voice made her want to listen. I've been living off my disability payments, but that's not really living, you know. It's just existing. I tried a couple jobs, but I couldn't handle being around too many people or having a boss breathing down my neck. Everything felt too much. James looked around the diner. But this place is different. It's quiet in the mornings, friendly, but not overwhelming. The first time I came in here, you treated me like I belonged somewhere, like I was normal. Margaret felt her heart squeeze a little. She remembered when James first started coming in. He had seemed so lost, so careful with every movement. She had just done what felt natural, treating him like she would any other customer. So here's what I'm thinking, James said. I wake up at 4:30 every morning anyway. Old army. Habits. I could come in early, help with prep work, whatever you need. During the day I could bus tables, wash dishes, take some of the load off you, and in return you give me breakfast and lunch. That's it. Margaret shook her head. James, that's very sweet, but I couldn't ask you to work for just food. That's not right. You're not asking, James said with a small smile. I'm offering. And honestly, you'd be doing me the favor. How do you figure that? James was quiet for a moment, stirring his coffee even though he hadn't added anything to it. When I was deployed, I had a job. I had a mission. I knew what I was supposed to do every day, and I was good at it. I felt like I mattered. He looked up at Margaret. Since I've been back, I haven't felt that way once. Not until I started thinking about this. The idea of helping you keep this place open, of having something important to do every day, that's worth more to me than money right now. Margaret studied his face. She could see he was serious, but she also saw something else, a kind of desperation that she recognized. It was the same feeling she had when she looked at that eviction notice, the feeling of needing something to hold on to. I don't know, she said. What if you get tired of it? What if you decide you want to move on? Then I'll give you 2 weeks' notice just like any other job, James said. But I won't just disappear on you, I promise that. Margaret thought about the morning rush that had left her exhausted and behind on prep work for lunch. She thought about her aching hands and the pile of dishes in the sink. She thought about how nice it would be to have someone to talk to during the long, quiet afternoons. But mostly, she thought about the way James's eyes had lit up when he talked about having a purpose again. You really think this would help you? She asked. I know it would, James said. I've been thinking about it for weeks, ever since I realized this place was in trouble. Margaret made a decision that surprised even her. All right, we'll try it for a week and see how it goes. James's whole face changed. The careful, guarded expression disappeared, replaced by something that looked like hope. Really? Really. But I have some rules. You show up on time, you work hard, and you eat proper meals. None of this coffee and toast nonsense. If you're going to work for food, you're going to eat food. James laughed, the first time Margaret had heard him make that sound. Yes, ma'am. When do I start? How about Monday morning? 5:30 sharp. I'll be here, James said, standing up and extending his hand. Thank you, Mrs. Sullivan. You have no idea what this means to me. As Margaret shook his hand, she realized something. Maybe she had been wrong about miracles. Maybe they didn't always come in the form you expected. Monday morning came faster than Margaret expected. She arrived at the diner at 5:15, wondering if James would actually show up. Part of her hoped he would, but another part worried about having someone else in her kitchen, disrupting the routine she'd followed for years. At exactly 5:30, she heard a gentle knock on the back door. When she opened it, James stood there with a small smile, wearing clean jeans and a plain white t-shirt. "Morning, Mrs. Sullivan. Ready to put me to work?" What happened next surprised Margaret completely. James didn't just help, he transformed the entire morning routine. He moved through the kitchen like he'd been there for years, washing dishes while she prepped vegetables, refilling coffee supplies, and somehow managing to stay out of her way while still being incredibly useful. But the biggest change wasn't in the work, it was in Margaret herself. For the first time in months, she found herself humming while she cooked. Having someone to talk to, even just small conversations about the weather or the morning news, made everything feel lighter. "You're really good at this," Margaret told him around 7 o'clock, watching him efficiently clear and clean tables as customers finished their breakfast. James shrugged. "Army teaches you to pay attention to details, and I've been watching how you do things for weeks." The customers noticed the difference immediately. Mrs. Chen, who came in every Tuesday and Thursday for scrambled eggs and wheat toast, was the first to say something. "Margaret, dear, you seem so much more relaxed today," she said, adjusting her reading glasses. "And this young man is very polite. Is he your new helper?" "This is James," Margaret said, feeling oddly proud. "He's helping me out for a while." Mrs. Chen, who had been a high school teacher for 37 years before retiring, had a way of sizing people up quickly. She studied James as he refilled her coffee cup. "Military?" she asked him directly. "Yes, ma'am." "Army. Thank you for your service," Mrs. Chen said simply, and James nodded with quiet dignity. After she left, Margaret noticed Mrs. Chen had left a larger tip than usual. Not much, just an extra $1, but it was something. By the end of the week, the change in the diner's atmosphere was obvious to everyone. James had settled into a routine that worked perfectly with Margaret's. He arrived early to help with prep, handled the heavier tasks that were getting difficult for Margaret's arthritic hands, and somehow managed to make every customer feel welcomed without being pushy or over-friendly. But the real magic happened during the quiet afternoon hours. That's when Margaret and James would sit at the counter, sharing stories over coffee. Margaret learned that James had grown up just 2 towns over, that he'd joined the Army right out of high school, and that he was struggling with nightmares and anxiety since coming home. James learned about Margaret's early days running the diner with Tom, about their dreams of expanding the business, and about how lonely the past 3 years had been. "You know," Margaret said one afternoon, "Tom would have liked you. He always said the best employees were the ones who cared about the work, not just the paycheck." James looked up from the inventory list he was organizing. "Sounds like he was a good man." "The best," Margaret said. "He used to say that running a diner wasn't about the food. It was about giving people a place to belong." 2 weeks into their arrangement, something happened that would change everything. Mrs. Chen came in on a Thursday, but instead of sitting at her usual table, she walked straight to the counter where Margaret was working. "Margaret, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be honest with me," she said in her no-nonsense teacher voice. "Are you in financial trouble?" Margaret felt her face get hot. "What makes you ask that?" Mrs. Chen gave her a look that probably worked on thousands of teenagers over the years. "Because I've been coming here twice a week for 8 years, and I know when something's wrong. You've been stressed for months. You're working alone except for James here. And yesterday I overheard you on the phone with someone about overdue bills." Margaret glanced at James, who was pretending to be very interested in wiping down the coffee machine, but she could tell he was listening. "Things have been challenging," Margaret admitted. "How challenging?" Mrs. Chen pressed. Margaret sighed. There was no point in hiding it anymore. "I got an eviction notice 3 weeks ago. I'm behind on rent, and if I can't catch up soon, I'll have to close." Mrs. Chen was quiet for a moment, processing this information. Then she asked, "How much do you need?" "Oh, Dorothy, I couldn't. I'm not offering to write you a check," Mrs. Chen interrupted. "I'm asking how much you need so I can figure out how to help." Margaret looked at this woman who had been a regular customer for years, but had never been particularly close. "Why would you want to help me?" Mrs. Chen looked around the diner, at the worn but clean tables, the pictures of local high school sports teams on the walls, the community bulletin board covered with flyers for church bake sales and lost cats. "Because this place matters," she said simply. "When my husband died 5 years ago, I didn't know how to fill my days. Coming here twice a week, seeing your friendly face, having somewhere to go where people knew my name, it kept me from going crazy with loneliness." She paused and looked at James. "And because I see what you two have done for each other, that young man has more life in his eyes than when he first started coming here, and you're not carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders anymore." James stopped pretending to clean and looked up. "Mrs. Chen, Dorothy," she corrected. "And don't you dare be embarrassed. I taught school for nearly 4 decades. I know when I'm seeing something special." Margaret felt tears forming in her eyes. "Dorothy, I don't know what to say." "Don't say anything yet. Just answer my question. How much do you need to stay open?" Margaret hesitated, then told her about the back rent, the supplier bills, and the equipment that needed repair. The total was overwhelming when she said it out loud. Dorothy nodded thoughtfully. "That's a lot for one person, but not so much for a community. Give me a few days to make some phone calls." After Dorothy left, Margaret and James sat in silence for a while. "She's really going to try to help?" James asked. "I think she is," Margaret said, still feeling stunned. "That's amazing." Margaret looked at James. "You know what? I don't think any of this would have happened if you hadn't started working here. You changed something about this place. You made it feel alive again." James shook his head. "We changed it together. I just helped you get back to being the person you always were." Neither of them knew it yet, but Dorothy Chen was already making her first phone call. And by the end of the week, she would have talked to 12 different people about Margaret's situation. Half of them were already planning to do something about it. The movement was about to begin, and it would start with one retired teacher who understood that some things in a community are too important to lose. Dorothy Chen was not a woman who did things halfway. By Friday afternoon, just one day after her conversation with Margaret, she had already called her book club, her church group, and 3 of her former teaching colleagues. Each conversation started the same way. "I need to tell you about something important happening at Sullivan's Diner." The first person to show up wasn't someone Margaret expected. On Saturday morning, as she was getting ready for the breakfast rush, a man in his 50s walked through the door. He was wearing a Veterans of Foreign Wars cap and moved with the same careful awareness that she'd noticed in James. "Are you Mrs. Sullivan?" he asked, approaching the counter. "Yes, that's me. Can I get you some coffee?" "Actually, I'm here about your helper, James Mitchell. I heard through the grapevine that he's a veteran working here." Margaret felt protective immediately. "Is there a problem?" The man smiled. "No problem at all. My name's Robert Torres. I'm the commander of VFW Post 847 over in Centerville. Dorothy Chen called me yesterday and told me what's happening here, how you two are helping each other out." James emerged from the kitchen, having heard his name. When he saw Robert's VFW cap, his posture straightened slightly. "Sergeant Mitchell?" Robert extended his hand. "Thank you for your service, son." "Thank you, sir," James replied, shaking his hand. Robert looked around the diner, taking in the homey atmosphere. "Dorothy tells me this place might have to close down, and that James here has been volunteering to help keep it running." Margaret nodded, unsure where this was heading. "Well, we can't have that," Robert said firmly. "This is exactly the kind of thing our post exists for, supporting our veterans and the people who support them." He pulled out his phone and showed them a social media post. "I shared your story on our Facebook page last night. Simple post, just said that a local veteran was volunteering at a diner that needed community support. Nothing fancy." Margaret leaned forward to look at the screen. The post had dozens of comments and shares already. "That's a lot of people," she said, amazed. "It gets better," Robert said with a grin. 3 other VFW posts have already shared it. The American Legion in Millbrook wants to help. And I got a call this morning from a veteran who lives about an hour from here. He's driving down this afternoon just to have lunch and meet you both." James looked stunned. "People are really doing that?" "Son, you'd be surprised how many veterans are looking for ways to help each other. And when they hear about a guy who's found his purpose helping a community business stay open, that resonates. That afternoon, Margaret couldn't believe what she was seeing. The lunch crowd was 3 times bigger than usual. Some faces were familiar, regular customers who had heard about the situation and wanted to show support, but many were strangers. People who had driven from other towns specifically to eat at the diner. A woman named Patricia from the next county over approached Margaret after finishing her meal. "I saw the post about your diner on Facebook. My dad was a veteran and he always said the best therapy was having work that mattered. I wanted to come support what you're doing here." She left a $20 tip on a $12 meal. By Sunday, things had gotten even busier. James, who had been nervous about so many new people at first, seemed to thrive on the energy. He moved between tables with confidence, chatting easily with the veterans who came to meet him and treating every customer like they were important. "I've never seen anything like this," Margaret told Dorothy, who had stopped by to see how things were going. "Yesterday we served more people than we usually do in a whole week." Dorothy smiled knowingly. "This is just the beginning, dear. Wait until you see what happens when the newspaper gets involved." "The newspaper?" "My nephew works for the county paper. I called him Friday night. Monday morning brought a surprise that changed everything. A young woman with a camera and notebook walked into the diner during the breakfast rush. "Hi, I'm Rachel Kim from the County Herald. I'm looking for Margaret Sullivan and James Mitchell." Margaret's hands were full with orders, so James walked over to greet her. "I'm James. Mrs. Sullivan is cooking right now. Can I help you?" "I'd love to talk to both of you about what's happening here. We've been getting calls from readers who saw the social media posts about your partnership. They want to know more about the veteran who's helping save a local diner." The interview took place during the afternoon lull. Rachel asked thoughtful questions about how they'd met, what their arrangement meant to each of them, and what the diner meant to the community. Margaret found herself talking about Tom, about the struggle to keep the business going, and about how James had given her hope when she was ready to give up. James spoke quietly but honestly about his difficulties adjusting to civilian life and how working at the diner had given him purpose and peace. "What's your goal here?" Rachel asked them. "What would success look like?" Margaret and James looked at each other. They'd never really talked about long-term plans. "I just want to keep the doors open," Margaret said. "I want to keep serving the community. Keep this place alive for people who need somewhere to belong. And I want to keep helping," James added. "This place, Mrs. Sullivan, our customers, they've given me back my life. I want to make sure that continues." The article came out Wednesday morning with the headline, "How a Veteran and a Widow Are Saving Each Other." It was on the front page of the local section, with a photo of Margaret and James working side by side in the kitchen. By noon, Margaret's phone was ringing constantly. Local radio stations wanted interviews. A food blogger from the state capital wanted to visit. The mayor's office called to ask if they could help with anything. But the most amazing thing was what happened to their customer base. Thursday brought people from 4 different counties. Veterans, sure, but also families, retirees, young couples, and business people who had read the article or heard about it from friends. A group of local business owners came in for lunch and left a proposal on Margaret's table. They wanted to set up a fund to help small businesses in town that were struggling. Margaret's diner would be the first recipient. "I don't understand," Margaret told James that evening as they counted the day's receipts. 3 weeks ago I was ready to close. Now people are calling from towns I've never even visited." James was cleaning the grill, his movements sure and practiced. "I think people want to believe in something good. They want to see that helping. Each other still matters. But why us? We're not special." James stopped what he was doing and looked at her. "That's exactly why, Mrs. Sullivan. We're not special. We're just 2 regular people who decided to help each other when things got tough. People can relate to that. They see themselves in our story." Margaret thought about all the customers who had shared their own stories over the past few days. The retired teacher whose husband had dementia, the young mother whose husband was deployed overseas, the veteran who hadn't been able to find work since coming home, the elderly man who ate lunch alone every day since his wife passed away. "You know what I think?" she said. "I think we accidentally created something bigger than a diner. What do you mean? I think we created a place where people remember that they're not alone, where they can see that problems don't have to be permanent, and that sometimes the best help comes from the most unexpected places. James smiled. Your husband would be proud of what this place has become. Margaret felt tears in her eyes, but for the first time in a long time, they were happy tears. Yeah, I think he would be. 6 months after that first eviction notice, Margaret stood in her diner at 5 in the morning, but everything was different now. The kitchen had been renovated with new equipment donated by local businesses. The dining room had fresh paint and new cushions on the booth seats, paid for by a fundraiser organized by the church ladies. Most importantly, she wasn't alone anymore. James was already there, of course, preparing vegetables for the morning rush. But so was Helen, a retired nurse who had started volunteering 3 days a week after reading about them in the paper. And Kevin, a young veteran who had been struggling with depression until he found purpose helping at the diner. The staff had grown organically, all volunteers who found meaning in being part of something special. "Morning, Mrs. S.," called out Anthony, another veteran who came in early to help with breakfast prep. He'd been unemployed for 8 months before James encouraged him to volunteer. Now he was enrolled in culinary school and working part-time at 2 restaurants, but he still made time to help at the diner because, as he put it, this place saved my life. Margaret smiled, pouring coffee for everyone. The morning routine had become a symphony of teamwork, with each person knowing exactly what needed to be done. But it was more than just efficiency. There was laughter, conversation, and a sense of family that Margaret had never expected. The changes went far beyond just having help. The diner now stayed open until 8 in the evening, serving dinner to families and offering a senior discount that brought in elderly customers who might otherwise eat alone. They had added a small section of the dining room dedicated to honoring local veterans, with photos and stories submitted by families throughout the county. But the most surprising change was what happened every Tuesday night. That's when they hosted what Helen had started calling Community Connection Night. It wasn't anything fancy, just coffee, dessert, and conversation. Veterans could come talk to other veterans. Senior citizens shared stories with younger people. Families knew. Town met their neighbors. It had become the most popular night of the week. "You know what I realized yesterday?" James said as he prepped potatoes for hash browns. Margaret noticed how different he looked now, confident, relaxed, with a smile that came easily. The careful, watchful expression he'd worn when they first met was gone. "What's that?" 6 months ago, I was collecting disability payments and spending most of my time alone in my apartment, watching TV and trying not to think too much. Now I'm managing a kitchen staff enrolled in business classes at the community college, and I actually look forward to getting up in the morning. Margaret felt that familiar warmth in her chest that came whenever she realized how much their lives had changed. Your mom would be proud. James had told her about his mother who had died while he was deployed. One of his biggest regrets was that she never got to see him find his way after the military. I think she would be, he said quietly. I think she'd love this place. The morning rush brought familiar faces and new ones. Dorothy Chen, who had started it all with her phone calls, came in every Tuesday and Thursday like always. But now she brought friends from her book club. Robert from the VFW post was there with 2 other veterans who had driven down from the next county. But the biggest surprise walked through the door at 9:30. Margaret looked up from the grill to see a man in an expensive suit accompanied by a woman with a camera. Are you Margaret Sullivan? The man asked. That's me. Can I help you? I'm David Park from Channel 7 News in the state capital. We'd like to do a feature story about what you and James have built here. Margaret nearly dropped her spatula. Television news? We've been following your story since that first newspaper article. Our viewers have been asking us to come see the diner for ourselves. James appeared from the dining room, wiping his hands on his apron. Everything okay, Mrs. Sullivan? David's eyes lit up. You must be James. Perfect timing. We'd love to interview both of you. The interview took place during the lunch rush, which turned out to be perfect because it showed how busy and successful the diner had become. David asked about their partnership, the volunteer program that had developed, and what their story meant to other communities. What would you say to other veterans who are struggling to find their place? David asked James. James thought for a moment, watching Helen serve coffee to a table of farmers while Kevin cleared dishes nearby. I'd say that sometimes the best therapy isn't in a doctor's office. Sometimes it's in finding a way to serve other people. When you focus on helping someone else, you stop focusing on your own problems long enough to realize they're not as big as you thought. And Margaret, what would you tell other small business owners who are facing hard times? Margaret looked around the diner that had been her life's work. I'd tell them not to be too proud to accept help, and not to be afraid to offer it either. James didn't just save my business. He showed me that struggling alone is a choice. There are always people willing to help if you're brave enough to let them. The story aired 3 weeks later during the evening news. Margaret and James watched it together at the diner, surrounded by their volunteer staff and regular customers who had become like family. Watching herself on television felt surreal to Margaret, but what really got to her was seeing how the camera captured the atmosphere of the diner. The easy conversation between customers and staff, the obvious care everyone took with their work, and the genuine happiness on people's faces. Look at that, Helen said, pointing at the screen. You can actually see how much this place means to people. The response to the television story was overwhelming. Phone calls came from veterans organizations across 3 states wanting to know how they could start similar programs. Small business owners called asking for advice on building community support. Other diners and restaurants wanted to know about hosting their own community nights, but the call that meant the most came 2 days after the story aired. It was from a woman named Carol in a town 4 hours away. Mrs. Sullivan, she said, I'm a widow and I've been struggling to keep my late husband's auto repair shop running. After seeing your story, a veteran in my town offered to help me in exchange for learning about car repair. I just wanted to thank you for showing us that this kind of partnership was possible. Margaret felt tears in her eyes as she hung up the phone. James was restocking coffee supplies nearby and had overheard the conversation. That's the 4th call like that this week, he said. I know. I can't believe people are actually doing this in other places. Why can't you believe it? We proved it works. Margaret looked around the diner that had gone from facing closure to becoming a model for other communities. The lunch crowd was winding down, but several customers were lingering over coffee, reluctant to leave the warm atmosphere. At table 6, 2 veterans were talking quietly about their experiences overseas. At the counter, an elderly woman was showing photos of her grandchildren to Helen. In the corner booth, a young couple was sharing a piece of pie and making plans for their upcoming wedding. You know what Tom used to say? Margaret said to James. He said the best businesses don't just serve customers, they create community. James smiled. I think he'd be amazed at what we've created here. We, Margaret repeated, loving how natural that word felt now. I like the sound of that. As the afternoon sun streamed through the windows, highlighting the faces of people who had found more than just a meal at Sullivan's family diner, Margaret realized that sometimes the most powerful movements start with the simplest gestures. A veteran asking to help, a widow saying yes, a community deciding that some things are too important to lose. And maybe, just maybe, that was exactly how the world was supposed to change. One act of kindness at a time.